Well, welcome everybody. It is so good to be with you today, and we are excited to be having another conversation about how to lead well during COVID. And I'm going to be on the back end, just helping, supporting, sharing any questions or comments that we have in the chat room. If you're not in there already, jump in there, let us know where you're watching from. But I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan, who's going to be hosting us today. Jonathan, take it away.
Hey, friends. Glad that you've joined us for this event, this moment where we're looking at preaching and teaching, leading through this crisis that we're presently engaged in. And I know we're going to have people from different traditions, Christian traditions, and I couldn't be happier with the two people that will be a part of this conversation. I was thinking a lot as one of the lead pastors that I've been communicating with throughout this crisis. He said at one point, he said, there's only so many care messages I can preach. And I thought, boy, isn't that true, right? It's probably an appropriate first response as we all scramble to make church work and we're no longer in physical community and there's lots of anxiety that people are experiencing. So there were probably appropriate initial messages. But I couldn't help but think of a moment when my boys were much younger and I was walking them to school and we just had a habit of always praying protection over them, protection over them, protection over them. And just it hit me in a moment, probably God, where I realized that that's a really incomplete message I'm giving them. It's one to be afraid. It's one that keeps everything about safety. And while praying for protection is not wrong and praying for safety is not a wrong thing, I realized it's very incomplete because I wasn't praying about their boldness, their witness, their ability to be salt and light in that school setting. And I feel like we're in a really unique moment as pastors, preachers, and teachers that our messaging is very important. And so that kind of led to a moment where I reached out to the two people that will be a part of our conversation today, because I just thought, first off, I have so much respect for both of them. Communicators, but theologians, people that I think are thinking in ways that maybe as pastors, you may not have the luxury. If you're like me, there's so many things coming at you right now, and we'll end our time just with a moment to pray for you. But I want to introduce our speakers. They may be familiar to most of you, if not all of you. Before we jump into some of the questions and some of the ability to respond to this crisis through preaching and teaching. If you haven't already, jump into the chat room, just identify yourself, tell us where you're watching from. Matt's going to be curating questions. This is a great opportunity in the chat room. Maybe if one of our speakers says something profound, hoping so. If they do, then you might want to put it in the chat room, just a comment, because what it does is kind of take your highlighter, and it can be so encouraging to other people listening in as they read back the transcript of our chat room. But also, too, if there are questions you have for Van or Peter, that'd be a great opportunity. Jump in the chat room and leave a comment or question there. So the first one I want to introduce is Van Johnson. And Dr. Van Johnson is someone that I've known for many years. I've known him longer than he's known me. Because of his influence in our movement for over 30 years, since 1983, he's been an ordained minister with the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada. Van is also the Dean of Masters Pentecostal Seminary. He teaches at Tyndale Seminary, affiliated with Masters College and Seminary, of course. He's taught out west at Western Pentecostal Bible College, Eastern Pentecostal Bible College. So he's an academic, but I've known Van more intimately for his practitioner side. He has served at One Church TO here, Agincourt Pentecostal Church for I don't know how long, Van, a lot of years, as one of the principal worship leaders in our church, but also a teacher and contributor in leading and feeding the people of this great congregation. And so he comes also not just as an academic, he comes as a practitioner. And then Dr. Peter Neumann. Now, I've known Peter since 1988. We did our undergrad together. And I've watched Peter just go from that undergrad level, master's, doctoral in theology that he has. And now he works at Masters College and Seminary as a faculty member since 2001. And he's the academic dean of the school there. I don't know if he's technically Van's boss. I have no idea how that actually works, but maybe not. I think you'll notice that there's probably a little bit of jockeying between the two of them. We'll probably witness that over the next few minutes together. But Peter is a brilliant mind and a great heart. And again, like Van, not just an academic, a practitioner. I know his heart for his local church in Whitby, Ontario, King Street Church, and how much he loves that and supports the pastors there and the ministry there. But he's also been a practitioner for 11 years, pastoring in both Richmond Hill and Markham. So, and Matt Smith, as he already started our conversation out, Matt is one of our directional leadership team members here. He's going to be in the chat room. He'll be bringing your questions to these two people over the next little while. So why don't you take a minute, just say hi, Peter, and say hi, Van.
Yeah, great. Okay, so as an employee of Peter's, I'll start by saying, and here is Peter.
It's already started. John, thanks so much for having us here today, and hello, everyone.
So let's jump right in. We've kind of curated some questions. Maybe Matt can put them in the chat room just to get our conversation started. And so this first one, I'll look to both of you to respond, but initially, Van, if you can take the lead as the more senior person in this chat, in this conversation. And the question is this: sometimes the way forward can be seen by looking backwards. With that in mind, how can viewing church as it is navigating these troubled waters, how can viewing it through a past lens help us today? Van?
Yeah, and my thanks to Jonathan. This is a great idea. Well, the church has a lot to teach us because obviously the church is no stranger to crisis. I was trying to think last night whether there's any book of the Bible, let alone the New Testament, that doesn't have some kind of crisis in the background. Some situation, right? So the church has a long history of handling crisis, whether it's a crisis caused by the fact that it's constituted to challenge society. So there's blowback that comes against the church as it stands for the kingdom, or just the natural crises like we're going through now that are common to humanity. And I think, and I'll keep my my first answer rather short and to the point here. I think the church's secret and the tradition it hands on to us is that the church has traditionally, when it's at its best, never taken what's going on in this world too seriously. So for the church, it's not simply that, this too will pass, but this whole world will pass. And coming from that framework, you sort of get arm's length, I guess, in COVID, 6 arms length away from a situation. And though it affects us, this isn't the only life we will live. In other words, it's the eschatology, it's the belief of the church that these are the last days, something good has started, and that will carry on to the return of Jesus. That gives us hope in all of this. And I think it's our ability to say we feel the pain, but there is hope beyond. And during the next little bit, I'll probably talk more about that future aspect. But as Peter and I were chatting about this, he said, "Well, let's not forget the present aspect of our eschatology." So, Peter.
Well, I'll get to that present piece perhaps as we go through this a little bit later, but I'm glad to hear Van is sticking to the Bible today. That's refreshing. And no, but I just want to echo what he's saying. The church, I think, has been able to get through so many things by grounding themselves in a future hope, a hope of the return of Jesus, the hope of a new creation. And one thing I've noticed about that, what grounded that hope for the church, I see in the New Testament is often in the preaching. There's often a tie, not whenever the future is mentioned, to sort of saying, and this is guaranteed because Jesus is risen from the dead. So because Jesus has been raised, we know God has intervened in history in a radical way, and he's going to take us there too, into this new creation where there's the resurrection of the body and all those good things. So in other words, God's taking things somewhere, and one day everything will be right, which means that places everything we have now in a framework that isn't always as elevated, as highly as sometimes we make it to be. And so early Christians saw themselves caught up in God's plan. They lived for that plan. It enabled them to endure all sorts of crises. And then just one more thing I'll add here. I think it also allowed them to view suffering differently and view crises differently as it impacted them. They viewed it as participation in what God was doing in the world, leading towards somewhere. They viewed it as participating in what Jesus participated in sort of fulfilling the mission of God. And so the crises was a sign to them pointing that God is not done with things yet. Things are not the way he wants yet. And so that's, I think, allowed them to get through.
Thanks, guys. I think as church history is demonstrated, these are moments when the church has built a reputation, really. This has been moments where the reality of the resurrection trumped pardon the pun, trumped the reality of the present day crisis that was in front of them. And whether it was in Roman historic times, how the church walked towards the mess, so to speak, in these seasons was indicative of that faith and that theology that was rooted in a future hope. But here's another question, and hopefully, I don't know who I should throw this to first, but how have the nature of our expectations, the expectations that we have as Christians, followers of believers, influence what we are seeing and experiencing in this season, and what is being exposed through this in regard to the degree that we have bought into the system of this culture? I think that's a great question to just ascertain where we actually are right now. So, Van, I guess I'll start with you again, Van, and then Peter.
This is maybe the most interesting one for me in some ways, because, when you're forced to change your routines, you start thinking more about what you're doing and what you're not doing. And I've just heard many people say to me as a word of encouragement, and I always accept it, "Boy, isn't this a great time to be a believer?" And I'm thinking, yeah, this is our natural habitat, right? When we see things are amiss, there's hope. And I don't stop and ask everybody what they mean, but here's what I'm wondering is, what is the nature of our expectation that makes us so glad to be a believer right now? In other words, what outcome are we hoping for when we get through this? and what in the world is normal? So this is something I've been working through a lot, and I'm just wondering if sometimes what we might mean by our expectation is no different than what my neighbor hopes for. And we bring the God element in as a way of saying, hey, and we know we're going to get back what we had before because God is with us. In other words, I don't expect anything different than what the rest of the culture does, but I've got God with me. And then I could sing that chorus, he's going to fight my battles, right? So if that's all we're doing, and I raised that, this is really interesting to me, because I think our preaching and teaching needs to be really sensitive, particularly now, to what message of hope we're giving. I'll tell you why I think so much about this. Every year in my Luke course, I introduce the thought of Joel Green, just a brilliant Lucan scholar, who in his book on reading narrative says, if we don't know what the biblical narrative is, we're going to preach the culture's narratives. And I wonder if, and so he's got me thinking about the culture's narratives, and we've got to be careful we just don't preach those. Like what? Well, that prosperity is at hand and it's within your reach. Just be a good person, right? Or the cultural myth that progress is inevitable, sort of the evolutionary model on the steroids of science and technology, right? Like we'll get through this because the future is bright and pain and suffering can be marginalized, can become more and more marginalized as we go on, because progress is inevitable. Now, if I just think that God is helping me to do what everybody else in the culture expects in terms of let's just get back to brighter days, then I'm not sure that's really Christian hope. So I'm thinking about how to answer this one, and thanks for letting us know about this question in advance. So if I'm not preaching the culture's narratives, then what kind of narrative am I preaching, whatever text I'm going to? I'm preaching the biblical narrative that we trust in God, not in stuff. I'm preaching the biblical narrative that the best is yet to come in the world to come, not this one. I'm preaching the biblical narrative that pain and suffering is the way to glory and not just a way to bypass it. And I'm preaching and teaching that I'm confident in the future because my eschatology incorporates both what God's going to do later, but what he's already doing now. In other words, there's already signs of hope and life, within our church community now. So let's be sensitive to what kind of hope we're giving to people, and not just convey the idea that normal just means going back to what it was, 3 or 4 months ago. This is a good time for us to think about what our expectations are.
Thanks, Van. I think all of us who preach or teach, every message, every emphasis is an act of formation, and being mindful of what we're forming in people is critical. And to that end, Peter, here's a question for you. How might the current situation help refocus our expectations, followers of Jesus, the church even, and our self-understanding as followers of Christ?
Yeah, this is a good question, and I appreciate Van's comments here concerning cultural narrative and our preaching. I think that the present crisis has helped remind me that our expectations can be mistaken. Our hopes, our dreams, our anticipations for the future, which can all be good things, but they might not totally align with what God has in mind for us. And so a shaking actually can be a good thing, because it might be intended by God to bring us towards something that's better than we can imagine here. It reminds us that things right now are not as God wants them to be. There is a not yet. And so I appreciate, again, Van's pointing us to look at God's taking us somewhere. There's a plan here. It's not all simply now. Not that the now isn't important, but there's a framework to put it in. And I'm reminded of this. There's a Bible story with John the Baptist where he has expectations about Jesus, finds himself in prison, sends his disciples to Jesus, and he asks them, "Are you the one we're looking for? Are you the one?" And Jesus doesn't say yes, and it's too bad you're in prison. He doesn't answer him directly like that. He sort of says, "Well, here's what I'm doing. The poor are having gospel preached to them, people are being healed. What is it, in other words, John, that you were expecting?" And over we see the disciples having expectations that are misaligned. John the Baptist has expectations misaligned. Jesus says, God's working in and through me. Like, the work of God is happening. Are you going to make me fit into your expectations, or are you going to fit yourself into mine? And I mean, it doesn't work all that well for John the Baptist. I mean, his dreams don't get fulfilled, but he still finds himself in God's plan. So Jesus actually asks us to shift our faith and allegiance into him, to really say, look, we have plans for the future, but you have the biggest dream of all. You have the biggest plan, and you understand what's going on. So help me fit my life into that, as opposed to me fitting your God into my life. And so giving our faith over to Jesus, our allegiance to him. A good book on this is Scott McKnight's The King Jesus Gospel, that just sort of reframes that God's taking things somewhere, and we need to give ourselves to his plan. I'm reminded just quickly here of a metaphor in the New Testament for the church. One of them that we don't talk about as much as body of Christ is the people of God. That this is a new way of understanding ourselves. That is an identity marker, a self-understanding marker, that above my nationality, my ethnicity, above my political preferences, I belong to Jesus and his people. And it's insofar as I belong to that and have my self-understanding in that, that I will find security and I will find hope. And Van's comment concerning cultural narratives is very, very important. And he mentioned the idea of inevitable progress, the idea in our culture of optimism. And optimism is a good thing. We hear it all the time. Disney has taught us well, dream your dreams are going to come true. All these types of things. Don't worry, things are going to get back to normal. Except what if they don't? What if they don't? And Jürgen Moltmann, German theologian, years ago called the United States, and referring, I guess, to all North America, as the officially optimistic society. And he said, look, that's not actually biblical hope. Biblical hope, optimism's good, but biblical hope is the hope that all Christians hold, that one day Jesus is going to return, there'll be a new heaven and new earth. And that makes all our other hopes trivial. It doesn't make them unimportant, but it makes us place them in that context. And when we do, that gives us actually resilience during times of crises to be able to say, look, okay, things aren't working out as I had hoped, but my hope is actually in God's hope, where he is taking things. And so I think some of those biblical narrative ideas, replacing mere optimism for biblical hope, would very much help us in this time.
Peter, that's like fascinating. I think I've been thinking a lot because I'm speaking this week on divine healing, which is a funny topic, but it's part of a series we're doing. And I'm thinking about all the disappointment people have around this. Some who've experienced something supernatural, and there's an expectation of that, but also many who have been disappointed, where they've been prayed and they haven't been healed. They haven't been rescued from that moment. And yet everyone that was healed, they eventually died. Basically, divine healing was pressing the pause button, because it wasn't the ultimate thing of God's fitting into God's plan of expectations of the coming, yet to be, the new kingdom, the new world, the new heaven, the new earth. I know that a lot of pastors are navigating a lot of questions right now, a lot of tensions. We've seen it in our weekend gatherings as people have jumped in the chat room. Even their kids are wondering about some of these questions. And it's kind of like where is God in all of this? Even did God cause all of this? And so that in mind, I'm going to start with Van, and then Peter, I think if you can pipe in at the back end of this question, that there's a lot of questions being asked during this crisis, anywhere from where is God in all of this to this is the judgment from God. What are some theological perspectives that help us to frame this as communicators and as people who are helping to equip people frontline? So Van, you first.
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. And looking forward to Sunday. I can no longer use the excuse that I'm out of town for not attending church anymore. I've never been so regular. And isn't healing just a great example of what we're talking about? We're experiencing healing now as a community in light of the greater and final healing we'll have on that day. And every healing we experience now is just a sign of what we have to look forward to, right? Okay, so theological perspective on this. Where's God in this? Is this the judgment of God? Let me say this as carefully as I can. COVID, like any other crisis, anything else that happens in the world that is out of kilter, and it seems like based on human rebellion and the Genesis story, it's all out of kilter. In a sense, that all goes back, the origin of this pandemic, as with natural disasters, biological disasters, regime change, political disasters, that they all come out of the first couple chapters of the Bible in terms of how we're to understand their origin. And so you have paradise. God said, this is good. I like to say things are good. God looks at what he's made, says, okay, this is good. And then within a couple chapters, Adam and Eve are being physically isolated, separated from God's presence, and the physical ramifications of that actually pushed right out of Eden, right? So in a general sense, this pandemic to me is just another aspect of this sort of standing judgment of God upon humanity's rebellion. Not a judgment particularly because we're sinful in the last week or the last couple months, but it's just part of God's response to Adam and Eve. Okay, you've made this decision. Now I'm going to make one too. Life's going to be tough, and there's going to be pain and suffering, right? So in a general sense, this pandemic is an aftershock when Adam and Eve sort of, hit the terra firma. In the chat room, you'll see some books that Peter and I have listed. Here's an interesting one. In John Milton's Paradise Lost, looked it up last night, try and find it. Book 9. He's relating the temptation of Eve, and you'll see the line numbers in the chat room. he's got this great line in there, says that when Eve bites the apple, creation sighs. Oh boy. Oh no, sorry. Oh girl, here we go. It's like there's an immediate physical reaction that creation knows this is a huge mistake and we're all going to pay for it. So in a general sense, you look at this and you say, okay, this is another sign to us that this world is not going to last. It can't last. It's constantly being shaken, and this pandemic's another example. Okay, but what is this? How do we speak about this pandemic particularly? So Jonathan, again, I haven't missed any of your sermons. I think we approach this one not so much as, okay, this is God's judgment on the world because of this specifically, but rather we approach it like Jesus does when he talks about disaster in terms of the Tower of Siloam. He says, okay, 18 people die when the tower hits terra firma, right? And 18 people are under it. Were those people any worse? And then this line, but unless you repent, tragedy is going to befall you too. Okay, now that's really interesting. So let me suggest there are two ideas behind this. Jesus is saying there is no direct line you can draw between tragedy and God's particular judgment on something you may or may not have done. I mean, look, we understand God deals with us, but you can't simply draw a line, something bad happened, somebody did something bad. But here's the flip side of it, which is really interesting, which I think makes sense of what Jesus said. In the same way that tragedy doesn't necessarily indicate God's judgment, here we go. Lack of tragedy doesn't necessarily indicate God's pleasure. Hey, God must be sort of happy with what I'm doing. Like, I know I'm doing lots of stuff he's not happy with, but he must be happy enough because things are going well. Jesus says, look, tragedy hasn't happened to you, but don't take it to be that means that everything is good. This is your opportunity to repent before it's too late. So, Pastor Jonathan, you supplied my best answer to this. And that's our hope then, isn't it? That we have a choice to listen to God, to respond to him, and to be ultimately spared. And so the text to me here is if God's judgment upon humanity is expressed as separation, and so in a sense we're experiencing some of that, then God's reward to us, what we hope for, is to be united with him. And there's that great stunning scene at the end of the book of Revelation. Stunning scene. Forget the architecture of heaven. It's that stunning moment in chapter 21 where he says, I will dwell with my people. I will, again, no separation, right? And then that intense expression of intimacy, Revelation 21, verses 3 and 4. I will wipe every tear from their eyes. That's heaven, right? No more separation.
And that's so good, Van. Luke 13 is such a great passage in this present crisis. Peter, why don't you jump in and respond?
Sure. So good questions. Where is God in all this? And is God judging us? I think Van's provided a really good biblical framework for that. I think we've emphasized the eschatological not yet quite a bit in this discussion, and I do think we need that for a framework. Our hope is yet to be fulfilled. So, but let's suppose, given that we've embraced that, given that our allegiance is in Jesus, where is God now, and what are we supposed to be doing? A couple of thoughts here. Number one is Jesus teaches us in the middle of all this, don't panic. He says that he's going to be with us to the end of the age, and he is indeed with us by the Spirit. His resurrection, the outpouring of the Spirit, guarantees his commitment to us. And so that's why he teaches on the Sermon on the Mount. Don't get too worried. Be confident in God's ongoing present care. Look at the birds, look at the flowers. Look at your pets. They're not usually worried like we worry. And so there is a sense in which while we see crisis as a sign of what is yet to come, and even healing as a sign of what is yet to come. So we know that God's ideal is not here yet, but we know that one day everything is going to be okay. God's dreams are going to be fulfilled. And the way Paul says it is, it's, more than we can ask or imagine. James Bryan Smith, in his book, The Good and Beautiful God, points this out. And he says, this is actually a biblical narrative that we need to let go through our minds over and over, that as those who are given over to Jesus and are children of God, everything will be okay. And we know not yet, but it will all be okay. Julian of Norwich says it this way: all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And that focus on the now, that right now God is with us, is actually very spiritually healthy. It's very psychologically healthy. And it's probably one of the reasons so many pastors have leaned in hard on that direction in the immediacy of the crisis, to say, God is with us, right? It's okay. And that's actually very, very right. Here's where we need to be careful. Psychological peace is not the sole or even the primary criterion that guides what we should be preaching and teaching. It is one criterion that needs to be borne in mind, but it is not the sole criterion. Without the eschatological framework, the idea, if we don't have this idea that God's taking us somewhere, then this idea of it's all going to be okay gets simply reduced to life coaching and Oprah, that type of thing. There has to be a strong eschatological framework. But aside from that idea of don't panic, don't worry, that's where Jesus lived. And so he wants us to live there as well, because God is truly with us. Second item is this. Hope does not make us passive. And I want to be careful about this as well. It focuses our attention on the future, but it doesn't necessarily make us otherworldly in the wrong way of understanding that, right? So I think when the New Testament, I'm sorry to intrude on Van's territory here, but I think when the New Testament talks about, world, when the book of John, Gospel of John talks about the world, it doesn't mean planet Earth, so to speak. That's been declared good by God. It's not functioning properly now, but he means more so the world system. And so we don't belong to this world system. We belong to the future that is yet to be seen in its fullness. But in the midst of that, what do? Do we say, okay, well, we're just going to wait around? No, we're not passive. We're not trying to escape planet Earth. What hope does is, Jürgen Moltmann would say, it makes us yearn for what we're looking for in the future. Paul talks about that in Romans 8. But also it makes us very, very dissatisfied with the way things are right now. And dissatisfaction has all sorts of appropriate applications. We can be dissatisfied that there's people out of relationship with God, and so that invigorates our evangelism. We can become dissatisfied where people are broken, and so we can then be motivated by the Holy Spirit to bring healing into those lives as well, or even just prayer for healing. But there has to be a deep, deep dissatisfaction, and that dissatisfaction of the way things are right now actually makes us not passive, but quite active. And so Jürgen Moltmann's helpful there. N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope, is good, although he's probably not as Pentecostal as Van would like. I just want to mention two other books here that might be very, very helpful for us when it comes to dealing with crisis and processing it. One is by Shane Clifton, Pentecostal theologian from Australia, who was in an accident, became a quadriplegic back in 2010. His memoir is called Husbands Should Not Break. Well worth the read, very raw details of what he's gone through. And he's continued to write about Pentecostals and healing and how we should process suffering. Very, very fascinating read. And I'm also reading presently Kate Bowler's book, Everything Happens for a Reason. Now, Kate Bowler is an expert on the prosperity gospel. She has an academic book on that. This one is her story about finding herself with cancer at age 34. And that myth of everything happens for a reason and how she's processed that. And I think how these folks are hanging on to a not yet in the middle of some real serious personal trials and tragedies. I think it's a very healthy way that they are viewing things, and may even call into question some of the assumptions that we bring, even as Pentecostals, to this. So.
Hey, if I can just jump in, I think, yeah, that's really good, Peter. And delighted to hear you refer to a biblical book, a New Testament book. In the book of John, Raymond Brown was the Roman Catholic scholar who probably said it best, said, every time you read the word world in John, it's not creation as such, it's a rebellious planet. And that's what gives the pointedness to John 3:16, right? It's not that he just loves birds and trees, but and as I'm listening to Peter, I'm thinking, okay, maybe this is one thing that I can just help underline, though you've done it really well, is that even though in a sense we're experiencing something of the, the echoes of the judgment of God here, the love of God keeps penetrating this. And so here, the love of God expressed to us in the middle of this crisis, right? For God so loved us in crisis.
Thanks, guys. Peter, that was fantastic, and Van, thank you for that. I've had a dog for years, and the dog died a couple of years ago. You know what I love about animals is they're never aware of the fact that death is imminent, and humans live their entire lives knowing that there is an end date, and there's an anxiety, there's a fear, there's a clamoring, a distraction that and probably more so in our culture today than ever before, we've removed death so far from our reality. We've hidden it in the back areas of funeral homes and everything that it's no longer in the living room. It's no longer that present reality. And for the Christian, it transcends that present reality, the hope and faith that we have. I know that I'd be guilty of probably not talking about death enough. In a way that frames what the ultimate win is, what the ultimate perspective is. But listen, before we jump into a next question, because I want to, I recognize some of you don't come from a Pentecostal stream, and these are two Pentecostal scholars. We're glad you're with us, but I'm going to ask them next to look back into our history, because I think the Pentecostal journey may have something to speak to where we are at, and other traditions may come at it in different ways, but bear with us for a moment. But first, I'm going to turn it to Matt. Matt, how's it going in the chat room? Any questions for Van or Peter?
Well, first of all, I just want to give a shout out to Peter Walters, who's apparently going to be sending some coffee to you guys through an e-transfer as a thank you, because it's been so valuable. But guys, great stuff so far. Dale Sanders says, can we preach the biblical narrative while adapting to the cultural narrative? So I think this is referring to one of our earlier questions. He's saying, I'm not suggesting we modify the message, but whether the culture will shape the way our message is formatted. So how do we involve the culture in formatting our message without adapting the biblical narrative?
Okay, so my part of this is really short. So what we're trying to do is take the biblical narrative and illustrate it with cultural examples, rather than taking the cultural narrative and illustrating it with biblical passages.
Great question. I mean, great answer, and also a great question. But that's a great response. That we got a bunch here, so we'll just keep moving quickly here. Dave Larmer says, I'm interested in hearing from Van and Peter how we can call people to joyful hope while making space for lament. So where's the balance in that?
So Van hands this one over to me.
Peter.
Yeah.
Well, he's your pastor. Go ahead, man.
It's true. It's true.
I've got my pastor on the screen. Give something to yours.
I do want to make a comment about that previous question. First of all, because I think it's a very important one. I think it's a very complex one. It had to do with how do we preach a biblical narrative message in the middle of culture. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think Van is absolutely right that I think I've noticed in the last 30 years, there's been a shift from preaching a biblical sermon and using illustration books, so to speak, to having a cultural, using the culture as our text and using the Bible as an illustration. And that might be a little bit harsh, but a good test that I tell my students is, after you've listened to a sermon, remove all the Bible references that were read. And if the sermon still makes sense, the content probably didn't emerge from the biblical narrative. So just something maybe to think about. It's not that it was bad, it might be good. It's just that it's just something to think about there. However, this is a really important question. This is a really important question because the church has always believed the church is Catholic, small c Catholic, universal, that the Holy Spirit will enable the Church of Jesus Christ to flourish and be expressed in any culture on this planet, not simply a North American culture or African culture or anything else, that it could be expressed anywhere, which means that it's not possible really to live out the gospel or preach the gospel without cultural packaging here. And so I think Van's right, but I realize this is a really, really complex question and probably almost something that we could leave to another entire webinar about contextualizing gospel message there. David Lorimer asked about lament and time for that. I think that's really important. I think that the inability to integrate lament into the middle of our worship is part of our buying into cultural trends that are healthy in some ways, but are over the top in other ways. So it's we come in, we're gonna sing songs of celebration, all these types of things, and that's all good. We don't want to mope, but at the same time, read the Psalms and like, boy, there are a lot of depressing themes here. Why is that? They're allowed to express them, and God is actually inspiring this, that we would use these. And so it must be spiritually and psychologically healthy to do so. And so I think there has to be time for this. I think we need to be patient in this process. I think we ought to not be too hard on ourselves as to how are we feeling? Do we have to come to church and feel a particular way? I've tried doing that for a number of years. Hasn't worked out too well for me. I think it's better to be honest about these things and let other people be honest as well. So great question from Dave.
Thanks. I think we should probably hand it over to you guys, but if we have time, we got some more questions for at the end.
Yeah, great. I'm just watching the chat room, guys. Great comments, great questions. Lots of reflecting back of some of the stuff Van and Peter have just said. But let's lean in a little bit here. And the question to both of you is this: what does the Pentecostal tradition offer us in this time of COVID? Are there any lessons that we can learn from it?
Every tradition has its strengths. I think one of the strengths of the Pentecostals was, maybe not so much anymore, but was the fact that they gained their identity. And we talked earlier about the importance of identity as the people of God. I think Pentecostals understood that their identity was the end times people of God. So everybody knows that Pentecostals draw heavily on Acts 2. What is not always seen is it was the eschatological phrase of Peter that helped solidify in Pentecostals' minds who they were, right? Peter said, this is what happens in the last days when God pours out his Spirit. So Pentecostals said, okay, we're people of the last days. Okay, so I'm going to be careful. I'm going to be careful not to go too long here on this, but I'm just fascinated with how eschatology works between the variables of space and time. And what the Pentecostals did here was they time shifted quite radically. They go from early 1900s and zoom back to the first century and adopt the conviction of the early church that these were the last days, which then propels them to the end of history. That's radical time shifting. And so time and space are interrelated. So when you take the temporal aspect, it changes the spatial. And Pentecostals quite naturally reduce their emphasis on the spatial because time had changed it. Time became larger. The immediate spaces around them lessened, so that we might say they became more interested in redeeming people than redeeming the space around them. Okay. But what's really interesting about what the Pentecostals did was, and again, I'm mindful of the time. Yeah, already 12:45. Is that this time shifting made Pentecostals very active participants. They engaged rather than isolated. They did not take their status as end times people as let's hunker down, store away in barns, pile all our toilet paper in the garage. But they went out and they said, if it's really this kind of time in the world today, then we need to go do something. The Spirit is enabling us. And that's what I hope we recapture. Anytime we're at a fragile point where we say, hey, we don't know how this is going to end, this is when the Pentecostal tradition says, well, okay, engage. Don't retreat, right? Okay, so on the bibliography, there's two things. If you're interested in this, there's an article that I wrote, Eschatology and Pentecostal Mission. You'll see it referred to there where I developed this space-time thing. The other thing is, and since my pastor is here, thank you for sponsoring this. This past fall, we did 7 weeks as a church on eschatology. Oh, what a gift. We did 7 teaching videos, and those are available. There's a price point to them. But what's interesting about that is this is great for young adults. It's great at this time. It's not directly related to COVID. We don't mention COVID. This was the fall. But you might want to take a look at that and consider it for a young adults Bible study. You know, maybe even Jonathan, we should be thinking about adjusting it a little bit in light of what's going on. Maybe you could change the price point for somebody who just want to do it personally. But there's a place on the site where it says, you know, tap on this if you want to look at some updates. So I'm really interested in this. I think this is the strength of our tradition. So those are two things, two places where you can go look at this a little bit more. Peter, what do you think?
A lot of good points by Van concerning the strengths of early Pentecostals. So the idea that they were centered on mission, centered on a future, they believed they were being caught up into God's plan and, you know, God's ultimate dreams. His hope was about to be realized among them, and the motivation for mission and to do something, it needs to be recovered. I think that's extremely important. So that eschatological framework, allowing that to motivate us for mission. They expected to see the signs of the kingdom manifest, salvations, healings, deliverances, God speaking, feeling the close, tangible presence of God. All of that helped them in living for God, being faithful, and also motivated their mission. I will say, as part of the tradition, there's things that we have to be careful about. There were some weaknesses, as Van mentioned, within every tradition. There's their strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes they chased signs. An earthquake happens, and this means that was because that city did this. And Van outlined that well earlier, that there's a nuance to how we understand judgment. One concern I do have is that Pentecostals adopted from their culture pragmatism, North American pragmatism, and put it on steroids. And it means this, that they felt caught up in God's mission. Yes, they're going somewhere. Yes, but they developed very little patience if something isn't seen immediately or doesn't work immediately. And God doesn't work that way. So if a strategy doesn't work, or if something is seen to be working somewhere else, we're going to go there. We're going to do that. And I would just suggest that for those Pentecostals that are listening, especially during a time of crisis like this, wondering, what do we do now? What do we do this Sunday? What's the newest technique, the newest thing? Be a little bit more patient with yourself. God is not nearly as worried about this as we might be. I don't mean don't be concerned with the responsibilities that we have, but a longer term patience is going to keep us from burning out. And growing up in Pentecostalism, you get this strong zeal piece to it, and that it works very well for short term, but in the long term, it can tend to lead to burnout and maybe even some people getting discouraged in the faith. I think we need to look at this as a marathon. And Jonathan, I've heard you use that term a lot. My own pastors use that a lot. I think it's wise. Let's get a little bit more patience in here, but that doesn't mean giving up the mission or the eschatological framework. It just means realizing God's working in a longer time frame.
Man, I'm so glad you said that, Peter. I think everyone's grown up in a different tradition. I'm an East Coast kid, grew up in a Pentecostal church, and I think spiritual formation was always, and certainly spiritual disciplines and everything, were not a part of our regular narrative because they take time and patience to develop in people and individuals. But even in the season, as I'm talking to pastors, I really hope, as we try to maximize whatever tools or whatever God's given us, it's not about competing with anyone. It's not about, it's about using what God has placed in your hands. I often think of David when he faced Goliath. We don't marvel at that sling, but that was an interesting piece of technology that was used by David in that moment. But we know that that piece of technology meant he didn't have to be coming close to Goliath. But at the same time, it didn't get the glory. It was the God of Israel that got the glory, that brought the victory that day. And I think too, we become overly dependent and overly, I think those things that glitter sure catch our eyes quickly. And I feel like that organic, systematic, patient growth, we're playing a long game, not a short game. And I know often that urgency piece is that short game, when we feel that urgency to do and to be and to accomplish. It's that old youth pastor narrative. Let's go win the school for Jesus. And of course, when they hit university, they realize this doesn't quite work that way. So Peter, I thought that was some wise counsel. Thank you for that. So I'm going to put both Van and Peter on the spot because of time. If you were in our shoes, leading, preaching, teaching each week, what are some narratives or texts or themes in our preaching or teaching? Let's get really practical here that you think we should be majoring on. So I'll turn to you first, Van, and then Peter, if you'd like to chime in, that'd be great.
So you have you have these two dominant ideas in the Old Testament: exile and exodus. That's really cool to work off of, right? Exodus, moment of deliverance. Exile, when our rebellion puts us back in isolation. So I'm looking at the great exilic prophet Ezekiel last night. And if I was doing a series right now, I'd probably do it on the first 2 or 3 chapters of Ezekiel. You see him tell you very clearly that he's in exile in Babylon near the river Kabar. And he says immediately, I had a vision. I'm thinking, okay, that's good. It's like Isaiah says, in the year that King Uzziah died, great king. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Like Stephen saying, as the rocks are coming upon him, I see Jesus. And he's standing up. All right. Here's Ezekiel. I'm in exile. And at the end of chapter 1, he says, I've just seen the glory of the Lord. Okay. So you've heard Peter in particular talking about suffering as part of our lives. Here is glory revealed in suffering. You wonder if he would have seen what he had seen if he wasn't in exile, right? So I would, and then you go to chapter 2 and 3, and then you see the message of Ezekiel, what he's told to tell the people. I would go there. If I'm going to the New Testament, and time is an issue here. 1 Peter probably addresses suffering as much as any New Testament letter does. I'd go there. And what's really fascinating, what you'll notice immediately, is that Peter says, let's understand suffering in light of our identity as aliens in this world, people of God, right? Strangers. That's really interesting. Handle suffering in light of who you are. Okay, that's good. Then, if I was invited back for a 3rd week, I would go to 1 Thessalonians. Pastor Jonathan, you hearing this? I got great sermon ideas. I would go to 1 Thessalonians that deals a lot with the end. And here's where I would go. I would re-preach the great sermon that people often use for the rapture. Now, whether you believe in the rapture or not is beside the point. It's the return of the Lord. And notice, in light of what we've been talking about separation and isolation, that 1 Corinthians 4 or 1 Thessalonians 4 is that great passage that says, hey, look, when Jesus comes, even the dead, and some of us know some who have been taken by COVID, some of the dead in Christ, they're not going to be left behind. You're not going to be, in fact, they're going to rise first. And then we who are alive and remain will be caught together to be with the Lord. There is the hope that when he comes, we're reconnected. So those would be my preaching ideas.
Hey, well, now I know where to go. Thanks. But we're in this year-long series on the book of Luke right now, and that's kind of your fault too.
Hey,
So
great book. Yep.
hard to lose on Luke. Yeah. Now listen, Peter, and you've already been leaking this throughout this talk. It's been so good. But if this is an opportunity for spiritual formation, maybe even to change in the way we do spiritual formation in the church, and some of the things that maybe we could be healthier on the other side of this because of this moment. Could you speak a little bit to that? What are those areas of spiritual formation that you see potentially emerging out of this moment?
Yeah, good question. I liked, oh, by the way, all of Van's suggestions there, but he would point out because I'm in the theology department, I usually don't use the Bible, so it's good to hear these suggestions. So I appreciate Van. No, but the idea of this is an opportunity to refocus on who we are as followers of Jesus. Does he have our allegiance? Are we his people, right? So that theme in Peter, you are the people of God, all of those types of things, I think are all really important. And by way of spiritual discipline, anything that can get us focusing on the fact that there's a longer term picture in mind other than our retirement is going to be helpful. Developing patience and not panic in the midst of this, and something to help us begin to reveal and identify what are the cultural narratives and what might even be, let's call them cultural idols. So the idols, I don't mean figurines here. I'm talking about the way the Bible talks about it. These are things we give our trust to more so than God. A very, very helpful book on this outside of the Bible is James K.A. Smith's book, You Are What You Love. A fantastic book on helping us understand how culture regularly shapes and forms us. Look, anything we do repetitively, anything we speak or act, this is why repetitive worship is actually so crucial. Anything we do repetitively is discipleship. But we are either being discipled for Jesus or we are being discipled for whatever cultural narrative is out there. There's no neutral space here. And the reason we get so shaped in cultural narratives is that we don't even know that they're happening and we feel them deeply. And that's part of the reason why sometimes I feel panicked or I feel other things are out of play. I want things to be normal. I've been taught that by my repetitive actions because of what I've been fed and enacted in culture. So I think understanding those cultural narratives and James K.A. Smith's You Are What You Love is really helpful there. So a season for identity formation, trusting in the Lord, not panicking, all of those types of things.
Man, that's a great book. I love that book and great recommendation. When you talk about shaping culture, Peter, we also have a church culture. And I think those of us who lead church, there are moments when you change something. It's not biblical. It's not even theological. It's a cultural thing that's been elevated to maybe even an unhealthy level in the church. So maybe Peter, just as we are cognizant of the culture and the world around us that can so easily influence, our teaching or preaching or even our leading. But what about the stuff we built in church world that is maybe not biblical or theological, but that's the normal people want to go back to. And we have this strong sense, at least those that I'm talking to, that it's not going to be the same on the other side. Things are shifting. So maybe speak a little to that, Peter.
Well, this is a big question.
Yeah,
I think this is an opportunity for us to reflect on what it is we do as God's people, especially as we gather, what is most meaningful for us. I was speaking to one children's pastor in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago who said that the initial response was, we're going to provide sort of virtual tools for parents as they take care of their kids. And she quickly realized what the parents appreciated most were not online tools they could figure out some of that for themselves, but it was the phone calls and the care and the share that was happening. That's powerful, for us to realize, okay, maybe, we have to have that connection, but do we have to produce a show? Do we have to have that stress upon ourselves, especially for mid-sized, smaller churches, to try to do what they're not resourced to do? Puts an awful lot of pressure on pastors, a lot more work to not only create a sermon, but then cater it to be online and getting all the rest of that up. So I think we're in a time where we can reflect on what's really important in that regard. We're going to learn some things. Some things might go back to the way they were. I wonder about the way we do worship, and don't want to get into that discussion too much, but just maybe say, well, okay, what is it we're trying to do there? If worship is a discipleship formation opportunity, what should it include? What will get us to the ends that God is aiming at, as opposed to what will immediately satisfy right now what we want? And I'm not saying dispose of the other, because I think those psychological elements are helpful spiritually as well, but placing it in a bigger story that this is a formational moment, and just taking the time to think through those things. And it'll be different in each cultural setting. But I think those are important questions to be asking.
And that's great, Peter. I was thinking of years Van led worship here. It was a discipleship experience. It was more than the music we were singing, but I do think there is psychological connection for each generation. They're going to connect to styles or moments that can be part of that spiritual formation moment. But what a great opportunity to take a step back and actually reflect on what we're building each week. And we think of leadership sometimes as making a decision, and we have an idea of some corporate type leader, but leadership is decisions, and they're the small decisions often that is forming a people, and stewarding that and being very careful with what we do with that. I think the longer I've been a pastor, the more mindful I am, the little decisions along the way, the decisions, whether it's teaching or decisions of what we profile or what we emphasize, all of those things are messaging things, and that's part of spiritual formation. In conclusion, guys, and maybe I'll turn to you, Van, first. When we were prepping just for this time with all of you online, I asked them, it came out of them. I love how much they love pastors. And I know firsthand, listening to some of you guys and just coming alongside other pastors, you got a lot on your plates right now. I know preaching and teaching comes with regularity, but there's finances, there's deacons, there's fear, there's all kinds of things coming at you guys at the same time. And everyone wants you to predict what the future is going to look like on the other side of this. And I was so encouraged just listening to Peter and Van, both mindful of the fact that as pastors, preaching and teaching is an important, but it's an aspect of what you do. There's care, there's funerals, there's coming alongside of people with deep problems in this moment. But so maybe just some words of encouragement. Van, maybe just some parts of maybe how the pastors and teachers could be focusing themselves in this moment. And then Peter, and then I'll just wrap it up here.
So I'm going to take something from Luke, and I'm going to read you the verse that was my favorite verse in high school, and it was my favorite because I misunderstood it. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. That was my life verse in high school. I went to youth on Friday night. I was in church all day Sunday. But for my faithfulness, God would give me the girl, the car, the job, the home. I love that verse. And I get to seminary and realize I might have gotten it a little wrong. There's something called context, where Jesus is talking about, like, look, there's a lot of stuff here about how God takes care of what flowers need and birds need. And then it became my favorite verse again. And this morning, getting ready, I thought, I'm going to talk about this. What this now says to me is that in light of God's calling on my life, if I pursue that, he'll give me everything I need to accomplish it. My word of encouragement to all of you is, boy, we didn't see all of this coming. And it seems like we are quickly unnerved by the fact that some of our resources are not as easily accessed. But the word of the Lord is to me, and I think to you, is that as we keep pursuing this, he'll give us what we need to do what he's called us to do. And for that, I think we're all grateful.
Pretty hard to top what Van has just said there. I think that the Lord gives us resources to fulfill anything He's called us to do, and in the midst of that, He asks us to trust. So I would just return to a couple of things that have been mentioned through our discussion here. Learn to. It's okay to be patient with yourself right now, in the middle of this, and to not necessarily feel the need to let every cultural expectation out there by which our culture would assess whether we are successful or not. I don't think God has the same things in mind as for whether pastors and ministers are being successful. And if we keep up with that, it's going to wear us out. And so, we've mentioned a lot today about things that'll challenge us, putting things into an eschatological framework. But behind all of this is the only reason God would ever want to challenge us is because He loves us and there's something better in mind for us. So He's with us. He really is. And it is a good time to be a Christian because the Holy Spirit is always present with us and will help us do what He's called us to do. So let's ask the Lord to help elevate our faith and elevate our trust so that we're not stirring up anxiety within ourselves or those expectations, and really recapture that biblical narrative where I think that Jesus can say, yeah, I've asked you to carry some things, but as opposed to what the world will ask you to carry, my burden's light, my yoke is easy in comparison to that. And if we find ourselves getting too stressed out, it may be that we're trying to carry something that He hasn't asked us to carry. And I have to talk to myself about that a lot as well.
Thanks, guys. That was fantastic. In the chat room, Matt will be putting up all of the social media as well as websites and things that you'll be able to follow Van and Peter, as well as their bibliographies. Maybe we can send out a PDF that would help with some of the source material for some of the things that they shared. We want to have moments where we can equip you. And, I think even as Peter and Van were just summing that up, I was thinking about how much over 20 some years of ministry, how my heroes have changed. I think when I was younger, my heroes were those who seemed to do dynamic things. I think it was maybe my Pentecostal leanings and the way I was raised. And boy, my heroes have shifted to those who were faithful and finished well. And I think of, in my context, it's the Stuart Mulligans. We celebrated this last year. It's the Charles Yates, who was a great friend of mine, who finished his race well. And I like what Peter said, it's really important that we not put on ourselves weights of what success looks like. I think success is being faithful to His word, faithful to Jesus, faithful to His people, faithful to His church. And we're going to be imperfect in that, but we want to encourage you, and I hope this was encouraging to you and helpful also. So we're going to continue the conversation, and just to let you know, next week we have another stackable webinar that we're going to have. In fact, it's going to be a great event, but if you have people in your context, and it might be you, who manage more of the communications. We realize a lot of pastors and churches are finding themselves now using digital tools that they've never leveraged or used, and it's just like David's sling. It's just the sling, but it's an important aspect of the story and the way that we do ministry right in this moment. So next week, 12 noon, we're going to have 3 presenters, and I'm really thrilled to have them. Jerry Sen, he was a digital marketing, head of digital marketing for Pepsi Canada, Google Canada, Maple Leaf Foods. He's going to come and share. Bart Aniston, he's a tactical strategist. He works with churches just on how to do social media, how to communicate well. And Dawn Payne from the United Kingdom. I'm excited to have her. She was the vice president of marketing for Universal Studios as well as Nintendo. Was responsible for the launch of the Wii and all that. So the 3 of them are going to be available just to talk about communication in this digital age. And so if that's helpful to you, or other communication people that might be helpful to, we're going to be here 12 noon next week. Matt, anything last things in the chat room, and then we'll sign off.
It's been very encouraging. A couple of things I just want to point out is we'll be posting in the description of this video will be available for replay, so you can share it with people in your sphere if you think they would value it. So we're going to also place in the description, once it's posted, a link to a bibliography that Van and Peter have provided for us for some further reading. It's quite extensive. So we felt it'd be better to actually share it with you as a PDF. And some of the questions that came up, sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them today, but I would encourage you. We've done a few other stackable webinars in this season, and you might find some of those answers in there. So you might want to go back into the archives and check out some of those. But such great, encouraging, and helpful comments and questions in the chat room. Thanks for being on this journey with us.
Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Van, and thanks, Peter. If you want to say goodbye, and we'll have a great week, guys.
Yeah, great. Bye.
Thanks, John. Bye.
Take care.